Morning everyone, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I hope you enjoyed the sunshine this weekend. We're here today to talk about the minimum wage, both the changes that are happening this year with it going up to £12.21 or a 6.7% rise tomorrow. And then in just a few days, on the 6th of April, as we know, employer national insurance contributions will rise substantially. And then we heard last week that the government is hoping that employment is the answer to mitigating some of the impacts of the benefits changes. We also have the Employment Rights Bill going through Parliament. So an awful lot going on in the same space. And we'll hope to talk about some of what's happening and some of those trade-offs. We will start in a moment with Nye Comenetti, who along with Greg Thwaites at the Resolution Foundation has written today's report. I'm delighted to also be joined by Paul Novak, General Secretary of the TUC, Louise Hallam, Chief Economist at the CBI, and Attila Linde, a Professor of Economics at University College London, and a leading scholar on minimum wages. So will hopefully help us navigate some of the trade-offs and perhaps differences of view that we have here today. But without further ado, Nye, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. And thank you, Greg, for writing the report with me. Greg's sitting in the front row there. Okay, so today I was going to do two things. So first of all, talk about the changes happening this week, and they are literally happening this week. The minimum wage is going up tomorrow, and the employer NICs increases on Sunday, I believe, April the 6th. And then also talk a bit about the minimum wage going forward. But all of these sort of hard charts are in the first section. The second section is just one slide long. So it's mostly going to be about what's happening this week and our view of the potential impacts of those changes. So first of all, so we have a surprisingly big minimum wage increase. That's the word we use in the report, surprisingly big. Why surprising? You might think we've had 10 years of fairly fast minimum wage increases. That's what you can see on the chart there. In the dark blue bars, you can see the annual increase in the adult rate minimum wage. On the right-hand side, you can see the increase that's happening tomorrow, 6.7%, as Ruth said, smaller than we've seen in some recent years. But the reason I call it surprising is that the government's policy on the minimum wage this year was actually fairly cautious. They said we want the minimum wage to rise in line with average earnings, basically. That's not the exact wording, but that's basically the spirit of the policy. Average earnings aren't going up quite as fast as 6.7%, probably about 4.5% now. So why do we have the 6.7% increase? That is largely due to a data revision. And I won't go into that, but part of the way the Low Pay Commission calculates the minimum wage increase relies on the level in the annual survey of hours and earnings. The ONS made a change to how they did that, so that gave us this slightly bigger minimum wage than we might have been expecting. Of course, you could say the bigger news, though, is what's happening on the youth rate. So I'm also showing you the increase in the 18 to 20-year-old rate, and that is increasing much faster. So by, I think, just over 16% for that age group, and for 16 to 70-year-olds, which isn't plotted here, it's going up by 18%. And that's because the government's policy is that the youth rates should converge on the adult rate. So that's why we have these faster increases. So obviously that's good news. I should start by saying that's good news for the workers involved. Their pay is going to go up substantially. It's going to go up, well ahead of inflation. So a real terms pay increase for something like 2 million workers is clearly good news, and that should be said first of all. But the main thrust of what I'm talking about in these slides is about the increase in labour costs that comes with that and what effects we might expect. So that's part one. We've got a big minimum wage increase, the seventh largest for adults in its history. Part two is we've also on Sunday got an increase in employer national insurance contributions. So two things are happening. The threshold above which employers have to start paying tax on their workers' earnings is falling from £9,000 to £5,000, and the rate is increasing from 13.8% to 15%. For low-paid workers, it's really the first of those which is the big impact. So it's that threshold change which is causing this big increase in labour costs for low earners. So that's what we're plotting here. We're looking at the weekly earnings distribution, and we're looking at the change in labour costs resulting from this tax change alone. And you can see it's very bottom heavy. So for some workers, and that spike is basically people who were previously just above the old threshold and whose almost half of their earnings are now being taxed. Their labour costs are rising by almost 7%. But for higher earners, the impact is much lower. They're basically just seeing the impact of the rate change. The threshold change for them has less of an impact. I think something like 1 million more workers' earnings are now being taxed as a result of that threshold change. And that's mostly women. Something like 2/3 of that extra 1 million workers are women. So that threshold change is the biggest moving part when we're thinking about low earners. So if we bring those two things together, what we have is a large increase in the costs of employing someone on the minimum wage who's working low hours. Now you might think that's being slightly selective. Obviously you'd get a different chart if you plotted the labour cost changes of someone working full-time on the minimum wage, because their hours are higher, they're not quite as close to this threshold. You still get quite a large increase, but not quite as dramatic as you do for part-time minimum wage workers. But I think this is probably the most relevant chart to show, because more than half, 60% in fact, of minimum wage workers are part-time. So I think this is a good chart to show. And we're looking here at the total increase in labour costs each year, broken down by a wage effect, so the minimum wage policy going up, and also by changes in employer NICs. And you can see that most years, at least compared to a counterfactual of NICs thresholds rising in line with prices, NICs policy isn't increasing the labour costs of minimum wage workers, but it is very much so this year. And it's about half the total increase in labour costs for that group. And it's the biggest. You can see that dot on the right-hand side of the chart is higher than any of the other dots. So it's the biggest ever increase in labour costs for a part-time minimum wage worker. Okay, so the next series of charts are about, well, what might we expect to happen next, having made these policy changes? So this chart is going to be in front of you for about 5 minutes, but there's going to be different lines appearing. So hopefully we'll all be able to follow it along. We've now moved to the hourly pay distribution. So we were doing weekly pay before. Now we're looking at the hourly pay distribution. We've got low paid workers with a low wage on the left-hand side, workers with a high hourly wage on the right-hand side. And first of all, we're again just showing the increase in labour costs as a result of these two policy changes. I'm removing here the increase in average earnings of about 4.5%. So we're just trying to isolate the impact of policy over and above economy-wide average earnings changes. So I hope that makes sense. That's why the scale has shrunk. We were looking at effects in the order of magnitude about 4 percentage points higher than that. So minimum wage policy is the blue bars, the NICs is the yellow bars, and you can see that they add up to a bottom-heavy increase in labour costs. So let's get rid of those bars and just focus on the total increase in labour costs, because that's the thing that matters when you're thinking about employers' responses. So what might we expect to happen next? Well, there have been many studies, both theoretical and empirical, in the labour market, which tell us that in general employers have substantial amounts of power in the labour market when it comes to wage setting. So when you levy a tax on wages, you'd expect a substantial part of that to be passed back to workers in the form of lower wages, and that's what the OBR expects as well. I'm hoping that some changes. Ideally, at some point soon, you'll see a wage effect. There we go. So a wage effect. So here I'm showing you what we expect what will happen to wages when employers pass this tax increase back to workers. I just need to explain some of the moving parts here. On the right-hand side, what you're seeing there is us following the OBR assumption of 3/4 of this tax change being passed back to workers. On the left-hand side, the reason that line isn't flat, because we've got the minimum wage protecting workers' wages, but we're thinking about this more in terms of what are the effects going to be over the next few years. Because the minimum wage is linked to the median wage, if there's a tax change which pushes down the median, that will also push down the minimum wage. So that's why for minimum wage workers, we've got a negative wage effect as well. I hope that makes sense. So what then does that do to the change in labour costs once you take account of this wage adjustment which employers have made? That's what it looks like. Okay, so employers are now facing a lower change in labour costs because they have tried to pass on as much of this change as possible to workers. So you can see for workers, in the top half of the wage distribution, really most of this change in labour costs has disappeared. It's been folded into wages. But that isn't the case for minimum wage workers, where because we legislate to make their wages sticky, they can't fully adjust. And so you still have this big increase in labour costs at the bottom end of the labour market. The final thing you need to then decide is, well, how do employers respond to that? They're facing this increase in costs. How do they respond? Economists think about, labour demand elasticities, and you can, find high and low estimates, and that basically says by how much do employers adjust their demand for labour when the cost of labour changes. If you assume that they make big adjustments, then you would find big employment effects. If you assume that they make small adjustments, you would get lower effects. What we've done is followed the OBR assumption for the top half of the wage distribution, but we followed the minimum wage literature for the minimum wage workers, which we felt was sort of the most appropriate use of the evidence to try and think this through. And in general, the minimum wage literature says you get smaller employment effects than you do overall. So if you plug all of those numbers in, this is where you end up with in terms of employment effects. So bigger at the bottom, because that's where the labour cost increases are greatest, and smaller at the top. In terms of numbers, we find an employment effect of 85,000 in terms of average hours jobs. Now, we had a debate in the office when we calculated that number. Is it a big number or is it a small number? You can decide for yourselves. It was pointed out on the way down that 85,000 is a Wembley stadium-sized number of people, which makes it sound very big. But when you think about there being 29 million employees in the labour market, you might think of it as being a smaller number. I think of it as a substantial number. And I think one way of seeing that is that if you only calculated the employment effects of the minimum wage change, you get to a smaller number of around 25,000. So what we're calculating here, the 85,000 number, that's the minimum wage change and the employer NICs increase together. So I do think we should think of it as substantial enough. And then the final point to make here is, as you can see visually, but just most of that employment effect is concentrated among low earners. So that's the group whose labour costs are rising the most, whose wages are at least able to adjust. So that's why 60,000 of that total is we think, in the bottom half of the hourly wage distribution. All right. So hopefully that makes sense, but I needed to explain all of our work in there because whenever you're producing these estimates, it's entirely reliant on the assumptions you make and the way that you do these calculations. So I hope that was helpful. So that 85,000 number, I think if the government was listening, they might say, well, that's not quite the whole story. The other change we made at the budget was to increase the employment allowance for firms, which is an offset that firms can make against their NICs bill. And we thought about this, but in the end decided that it will have some effect, but a small effect, and therefore we didn't include this in the modelling. But I'm just showing you this chart to justify that decision. So what we're plotting here is the change in labour costs for firms by the numbers of workers that they have in the firm. So over on the left-hand side, you've got firms with 0 or 1 worker. On the right-hand side, you've got firms with 50 workers. 50 workers, of course, is still a small firm. We call them an SME. We call firms with up to 250 workers an SME. So we're really only looking at small firms. But even within that subset of small firms, what the blue line is showing you is that the net change of the increase in the employment allowance and the increase in the NICs that they have to pay per worker only net benefits the very smallest firms, i.e. firms where they have 6 or fewer workers. So the vast majority of workers aren't working in those very, very small firms. So this will mitigate the cost increases for some, but not for many workers. I think we calculated only 4.6% of employees are working in a firm where this employment allowance extension fully offsets the increase in employee NICs. Okay, so what do we take from that? Well, one of the recommendations we make is that ideally tax policy should complement minimum wage policy. They should work together. The minimum wage is a great thing. It's raised earnings for low paid workers, but we know that it can also bring about employment risks. And so, ideally you'd want a tax policy which doesn't add to those risks, but which complements it. So just showing you a few different examples of changes in tax policy. So this is the actual change which the government makes. It's the same chart from figure 1. In 1999, when the minimum wage was introduced, there was a complementary change in tax policy. So this is the change in employee NICs which happened in that same year. So you can see that it was in general reducing taxes for low paid workers. Now, this isn't a completely fair comparison at all. That change was designed to be revenue neutral. The government wasn't trying to raise money. The blue line is trying to raise £25 million. So it's not... what's that? What did I say? Billion. Also a big number. But the point of this chart is to say that there are choices to make. The government didn't have to change tax policy in the way that it did in the blue line. We would have liked it to have chosen a completely different tax altogether. But even if you accept that employer national insurance was the tax that needed to be changed, you could have done so differently. The thresholds, for example, could have stayed where they were. We could have increased the rates. And if we'd done something like that, you would have had a much less bottom-heavy change in labour costs, and you would have had, on our estimates, lower employment effects as a result. So a recommendation that we make in the report is that at the very least, the Low Pay Commission should be able to have sight of big tax changes like this when it makes its recommendations. And I think in practice that means the recommendation that its rates recommendations probably have to happen after the budget rather than before it as at present. So Tim, you're going to get an extra couple of weeks to do your calculations. All right, so that's all our slides about what's happening this week and this year. I just have one slide on what next, and the key point to make here is that we currently don't have a minimum wage policy after this year, and that's quite unusual. Generally, we've had the government setting out multi-year plans for the minimum wage, either in the form of saying, on an ongoing basis, Low Pay Commission, this is how we'd like you to think about the minimum wage, or explicitly setting a target that they want the Low Pay Commission to follow. Those have lasted for 4 or 5 years in the past. But at the moment, we don't know what the government wants to do with the minimum wage after 2025. So we thought we would try to be helpful and write down what we think they should do. So first of all, we say we still think there is room for further uprating with respect to median wages. I would say there's been a bit of a mood music recently. Maybe if you read The Economist, and the FT might have picked up some of this. There are concerns about the effects of wage compression, for example. When we push up the minimum wage with respect to the median, that is very literally causing wage compression. We're reducing the gap between the bottom and the middle. But some people worry that when you do that, you scramble price signals in the labour market. You make it harder to recruit if you're trying to get someone who is just above the minimum wage. We do think about that in the paper, but we say the evidence of those effects aren't yet strong enough to justify abandoning uprating. So we think there is room to go further. We also look again at the full collection of studies which try to estimate employment effects. And as Aaron Dubé did when he did his review in 2019, I think you'd still conclude that overall the evidence says effects are small. But the context is different than it was in 2019. So we think that probably policy should try to go more slowly than it did then. So we suggest a bite-raising pace of about 1 percentage point a year, which is about half the rate at which we increase the minimum wage over the last decade. And the reason for that extra caution is because the minimum wage is at a higher level now, so we must be closer to its optimum level. It also means there are fewer studies to draw on to tell us about what effects you get at that level. The labour market data is currently a bit unreliable, and we also have big policy changes happening, so we need to be able to understand all of those things. Finally, we think we'd like the framework to hold on to its flexibility. So any data revisions we think should be phased in if they affect our estimate of the median. We'd like the LPC to have discretion to divert from this path if there are warning signs that justify it. We think we should hold on to the youth rates. Perfectly fine to have ambitious increases. The UK's youth rates are currently still fairly low compared to our adult rate, but we think it's useful to hold on to that flexibility. And then finally, linking to the real living wage, yes, it would be an ambitious thing to do. Yes, the real living wage is an important living standards benchmark, but we'd have less flexibility to respond to economic conditions if we did that. So those are our suggestions. And that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Nye. Paul, over to you. Really interested to get your reaction and thoughts.
Okay, well, thanks Ruth and thanks Nye for an excellent presentation. Maybe a few reflections from me on the content of the presentation, the report. Maybe though, just worthwhile saying one bit of context, I think, because, my shirt is open up there. It's not a very attractive proposition for people watching online. I mean, obviously, as you would expect at a Resolution Foundation event, lots of really solid evidence, lots of charts, lots of graphs. This is all really important stuff. But it is also important to remember that this is about people's livelihoods and people's incomes. And that £12.21 an hour, which is a very welcome increase in the minimum wage that we'll get tomorrow, will still leave lots of people in a really difficult financial position. So we did some polling recently. 1 in 6 workers skipping meals to make ends meet. 1 in 4 workers into debt at the end of every month because they can't meet their monthly outgoings, and 1 in 3 not putting on the heating because they can't afford, they're worried about heating bills. So for those people at the sharp end of £12.21 or lower, if they're younger, yes, welcome increase in the minimum wage, but I think it's important just to remember, the sort of real world impacts that this has on people. Maybe 3 reflections from me. I mean, I know without a doubt that for some employers, not all, for some employers this year will be difficult with that confluence of increases in national insurance contributions, the lowering of the threshold, as well as increases in the national minimum wage. But, and it is an important but, and I think it's borne out by the work that you've done, Nye and Greg, there isn't huge evidence base that suggests that increases in the minimum wage have a negative impact on employment. And we could talk about 85,000 people and Wembley Stadium, whatever. I mean, obviously, any job loss is one that I would be concerned about. This isn't 85,000 jobs, people being made redundant. This is the overall net impact in the economy. As you said, put that against 29 million people at work now and 816,000 vacancies in the UK economy. And certainly for me, the biggest issue I get when I go out and talk to employers, large and small, is still people struggling to recruit and retain staff. So I think any employment negatives, very small, likely to be outweighed by the benefits of higher minimum wages in terms of more spending power for low-paid workers in particular. And we know they don't go and squirrel that away in offshore bank accounts. They spend it in their local economy by and large, but also encouraging employers to invest in driving up productivity and so on. And I suppose, one of the advantages of being, I first became active in a union sort of 35 years ago, first started working for the TUC just on 25 years ago. And actually the last time I was in this room, we were at an event to mark 25 years of the national minimum wage. And maybe not to relitigate the arguments of the past, certainly not with you, Louise, but 25 years ago, it was contested when the minimum wage came in. Employers did say that this was going to have a devastating impact on employment. And I have to say, every time there's been a significant uplift in the minimum wage, we've had a similar sort of forecasts of doom and gloom. So I don't want to sort of minimise the confluence of those things that I talked about before, but I think it is important to reflect on what the actual real experience of the last quarter of a century has been. And I'd also point to the role of the Low Pay Commission, actually, because I think it has played a really important role in making sure that we've had increases in the minimum wage, good for low-paid workers, but it introduced in a way that doesn't have a negative impact on employment, which is effectively their remit. So, second reflection from me, raising the minimum wage is important. I think we have to put it into the context of the broader work that we need to do to recast our labour market, because I think in the UK, we've got far too many employers who are still addicted to a sort of low-paid, insecure model of employment. We've got a long tail of those sorts of jobs in the UK. That's particularly the case in the private service sector. So it's worth noting that the net profit rate for UK companies, private companies, is 8.8%. It's 15.1% in the service sector. And I get a little bit depressed that when we talk about increases in the minimum wage, it's always about it'll be the workers expected to bear the cost. Some employers could afford to bear more of this cost as well. I would say minimum wage is important. It's not enough on its own. And again, talking to low-paid workers, the headline increase in the minimum wage is no good if your employer just cuts your hours in response or has you on a 0 hours or short hours contract where you don't know from one week to the next how much you're going to be earning. And that's why things like the government's employment rights bill is really important. Giving people those guarantees of hours, giving low-paid workers, many of them for the first time, access to sick pay from day one would make a massive difference to their financial and broader well-being. But the employment rights bill, alongside industrial strategy, alongside Skills England, I think trying to recast the shape of the UK labour market really important. But maybe third set of reflections, Ruth, and I'll finish on this, maybe just in direct response to some of the points that you raised. Now, on future uprating, I would be cautious about setting a limit or a target about 1 percentage point per year. The TUC, we've obviously got big ambitions for the minimum wage. We'd like a £15 an hour minimum wage, and we'd like the threshold to be 75% of median earnings. But actually, I suppose the key thing for us is that that's what the Low Pay Commission's job is. And given the Low Pay Commission that sort of remit, or retaining that remit, to balance out and to take an evidence-based look at what's actually happening on the ground, I think is really important. I have concerns about the suggestion around the youth rate, partly because I just genuinely believe that people who do the same job should be paid the same amount of money. And frankly, if you're working in a supermarket, on a till, or in the warehouse, it doesn't matter whether you're 18, 19 or you're 25, 26, you're doing the same job. And you should be paid for that job. And actually that's reflected in the agreements that many of our unions have had with large private sector employers in particular, where they've moved away from youth rates. Final just political point on that, it's also a manifesto commitment. And I worry when politicians don't deliver manifesto commitments, and more importantly, the party of government should worry if they don't deliver manifesto commitments. And then the last point for me is I do have an aspiration for the minimum wage to be a genuine living wage. And I don't necessarily mean the figure set by the Living Wage Foundation. But I think we do have to go back to that starting point of £12.21. Building a life on £12.21 is difficult. And anything that we can do to boost the pay of low-paid workers, as I say, through the work of the Low Pay Commission, I think it is really important. And maybe just this final reflection, we currently subsidise lots of employers to pay their staff low wages. A lot of those workers will be getting in tax credits, support for childcare, some of them will be getting support for housing. I think it's right that we start to give that balance back to employers.
Thanks very much, Paul. And just before I come to Louise, I think we should come back to youth rates in the discussion. Just on future uprating, it sounded to me like you were suggesting a bit more discretion for the LPC compared to previous regimes where we've had a kind of target set by the government and the LPC are judging a path there. Am I
no,
right?
I mean, in terms of the terms of reference for the LPC, yeah. We think that it should be raised from 2/3 of median earnings to 3/4.
I see.
But I think you've got to give the LPC that discretion to sort of say, well, actually, they will have to assess what the impact of the national insurance contributions has been, and the employment rights bill, and the national minimum wage. That's their job.
Yeah.
For me, it's a really good example, successful example of a tripartite way of working. Employers, unions, independent academic experts sat round a table and having a genuinely evidence-based discussion. I think that's probably I'd be loath to lose that sort of tripartite approach, because I think it makes for better policy making in the end.
That's really helpful. And Nye, do you just want to explain how our 1% corresponds to the sort of bite level that people tend to think about?
So as Paul said, we think at the moment we're at 2/3 of the median wage. That is, the asterisk there is that, if we're wrong about what the median is, then we'll end up being wrong about what the bite is. But that's the Low Pay Commission's estimate of where the 2025 minimum wage will take us. So 1 percentage point increase per year means, next year you get to just below 68%, then just below 69%. And so that takes you to 70% in 3 years' time. And like I said, that is slower than we were increasing the minimum wage since 2016, where I think the average percentage point bite increase per year was just below 2%. But it is worth saying that we are suggesting that bite should go up. The government's policy in 2025 was effectively that the bite should not go up. So ours is a more ambitious policy than the government's was this year, but more cautious than has been the case for most of the last 10 years.
Great, thanks very much. Right, Louise, over to you. What do you make of it all?
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much. And it is really interesting to be part of this discussion. National living wage policy has been something that I've been interested in for a number of years, obviously at the CBI. At the moment, previous to that though, I was in the Treasury and helped write the recommendations to the Chancellor on the LPC's recommendations, and also part of the economics team there providing advice, including when the national minimum wage turned into the national living wage as well. And from a personal perspective as well, always been interested in this area, because when I was growing up, my mum was on the national minimum wage as well. And I think continued that interest in this current job. So I do spend a lot of time talking to employers about the impact of national minimum wage and national living wage policy. Actually, it's been really interesting to see the shift in those conversations just over the last few years. So actually the CBI has always been supportive of the national minimum wage, especially when it got to that point around how do you implement this in practice. Very much agree with Paul's comments around the tripartite system for that, which works incredibly well. And it obviously has a different impact on different sectors, particularly for retail, hospitality and leisure, but actually it didn't tend to be a big conversation with employers a couple of years ago. That has really changed, and it's been a really telling shift in where it's crept up the agenda over the last few years. Obviously, Naya's just gone through the figures, 6.7% increase this year. If you're thinking about 21 plus, that followed 9.8%, 9.7% the previous years. For those who benefit, it's obviously incredibly positive, but when you're thinking about it from an employer perspective, those are huge increases in the cost of employment. So those increases over the last few years added about £8 billion to employers' wage bill. If you put that together with NICs, that's about 12%, so you're looking at about £20 billion. That's before you even do the interaction between the two of you. And we've kind of mentioned as well, one of the other things that's coming down the road is the Employment Rights Bill, which government's own estimations suggest will cost a further £5 billion as well. So those are all quite chunky numbers. The OBR haven't this time round accounted for any impact of that Employment Rights Bill, but they have said when they take that into account in the autumn, when we've got a bit more information on it, they do expect it to have a negative impact on employment, on prices, on productivity as well. So completely agree with the evidence in terms of, at the moment, we haven't seen any of that clear impact on unemployment. But I do think, and especially talking to employers, we do feel it in many other ways. So again, everybody here is probably very conscious about the increase we've seen in 0-hour contracts over the last few years, that kind of feeling of greater work intensity for the lower earners, and that squeeze on pay differentials has also been really important. So one of the things I often hear from employers is how actually they're talking to their staff about promotion opportunities, and they don't want to go for them because actually the wage differential that the employer can offer, the employee thinks that that's quite small compared to that increase in responsibility. And for me, that's quite worrying if you hear those stories, because that's just taking that next step. And if they're not taking that next step, what does that mean for future progression as well? So whilst I don't think, like I say, there is that evidence about the unemployment impact, I think actually you are seeing that impacts on the wider labour market. And I think that is a symptom of the kind of stress on the kind of employers, especially at that lower end. So completely agree that the national living wage is a good thing. But I think one of our main observations is that actually, if you're thinking about wider national living wage, national living standards strategy, you need to think about wider than just national living wage. And I think over the last few years, the national living wage has been quite a convenient lever for the government to pull when it's trying to say it's doing something on living wage, living standards, rather than actually tackling the bigger problem, which we know that we have in the UK, which is around productivity. That is obviously much harder to solve, but unless you're solving that, then you're just using the national living wage as a kind of forcing mechanism, but you're not actually got that overall labour market strategy and that support for employers that's trying to do that as well. And I think one of the reasons why it's particularly an issue at the moment is not only because of those three things that we talked about in terms of national living wage increases, NICs increases, Employment Rights Bill coming down the line, but also you've got the policy from the government, as they say, about trying to encourage more people into work, which is incredibly important. We've got 3.5 million people at the moment in the UK who are out of work, say that they would like to work, 1 million young people who are out of education, employment and training. And as, again, nice charts showed, the impact of those policies that we're talking about are all hitting people at that lower end. Vast majority of them entry-level jobs. Employment Rights Bill will mean that it is riskier for an employer to take a chance on somebody who perhaps hasn't been in the labour market before or is just coming back into the labour market. So again, I think it's thinking about what is the overall strategy in this space, and where actually it appears to us that the government is trying to push people onto the kind of ladder of opportunity at the same time as employers are being forced to kind of remove some of those rungs because they're under pressure to do so. So I think whilst we completely agree, as I say, national living wage is a really great policy to lift people out of poverty, if you're thinking about income distributions being compressed, people in the middle feeling that they're squeezed, never mind people at the bottom as well, I think, as we say, the big thing for us is you can't rely on minimum wage policy alone. You need that more comprehensive strategy. You need to think about how the skill system works together with the industrial strategy, local growth plans. Another manifesto commitment we've got is around reform of the apprenticeship levy, which is really important to turn it into a growth and skills levy. We need to see more action on occupational health support. Again, if you're getting people into work, that support is there. And a national tech adoption strategy as well, to think about how do we have that drive for productivity as well. So I think the recommendations in the report are great. I would definitely echo that point around caution in terms of where we are now, and that point around you need to really think about the context that the national living wage is landing in, and actually where it's better to have that wider strategy from government when they're thinking about raising living standards.
Great, thank you very much, Louise. And I'll come to Attila and then we'll come to questions. If anyone online would like to ask a question, you can do so on Slido, and the hashtag is minimum wage with a capital M and a capital W. But Attila, really interested to get your perspective on these issues before we do that.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm really enjoying this discussion. I very much agree the sentiment in the room that this national living wage seems to be a great success so far in terms of raising living standards at the bottom of the wage distribution. And I also, there are things that mainly coming from more international evidence that it also improves some of the issues that the UK government face, for instance, productivity improvement, forcing businesses to think creatively, to use the labor force in a more efficient way. I think all of these kind of things are success of the current minimum wage policy. Now, I also agree with the sentiment more discussed in the presentation that it's unusual to have minimum wage increase with tax increases on the employers, partly because the government usually wants to increase the wages at the bottom in a way that helps the poor people, but not increase the cost of the businesses. So I think this is definitely an unusual policy, and I understand the revenue, the need for revenue, but it strikes me maybe not the best way to raise the living standards and make sure there is no disemployment effect of the policy. Now, the discussion that I wanted to contribute is first. Given that there is a great success of the policy, the next question is like, what should we do next? And whether we should raise the level, and then the next step is how to raise the level. Now, I kind of think that the UK has a very ambitious minimum wage policy, but given the great success, there is definitely scope for even further raise. And the way I would think about how to set the level would be to think about what do we think currently, what's the main issue at the low wage labor market? Is it the main issue is the lack of jobs, or is the main issue is the lack of good jobs? And I think if you look at, for instance, aggregate statistics, you see that still the UK labor market is very tight these days. There might be some cooling, and it's unclear. I think it's kind of unfortunate that there are lots of conflicting evidence coming in. So it needs a very thoughtful looking at the data, what's going on. But I feel still that if I have to guess, it's still the labor market is tight, and it implies to me that there is still the issue is not mainly the lack of jobs, but it's really like a lack of higher quality jobs in the labor market. So that strikes me that it still there is a potential scope for improvement because of them. Until I don't see that really there are lots of low skilled workers who are really struggling to find job, I would be more ambitious. The second is about the youth minimum wage, which was touched. In that respect, I kind of agree that it's so far what we see in the data. Steve Machin and Giulia Giopone has a fascinating study studying the UK context, this youth minimum wage policies, and they concluded that first of all, very few employees utilizing it. partly because there is this just fairness concern that it's very hard to employ people in the same position with different wages. It's just like not fair. And I also fear that they also show it that this is happening, the spillover effects of the adult minimum wage to the youth minimum wage is happening more in a context where people of young and older people work together in the same position. And if you just let this youth minimum wages different and firms start to utilize, one way to utilize is there is a segregation in the labor market. There will be positions for young people and there's positions with older people. And I think it could have negative consequences, like it could affect negatively knowledge spillovers from the more experienced people to the less experienced people. It could also put people into positions, like young people, like really low quality positions with not upward trajectory. So it could be that, you are right, that it could be that some of these people might not put in the right level of position, but I'm also afraid that they put permanently, like there will be some positions that permanently low quality and they only just use people for that. So my reading is that the best available evidence on that, some of it is coming from the UK context, that these youth minimum wage policies could be not very beneficial, in fact, to allow young people's trajectories evolve. So I kind of in favor of making businesses to say this is the level of minimum wage and you have to find a way to integrate the young people. And given the labor market is tight, I think firms will find a way. So if there would be a very much lack of job problem, I wouldn't be more that ambitious on that. And finally, I just want to make a comment on the policy about, okay, let's suppose we agree to a level, which I think would be good. I think it's good if the government, with the discussion of low pay commission and experts, agree a level, a target. I thought it's a very good idea in the UK to do that. Then I think I would be more favor of going more quickly than slower. And part of the reason, because I as a scientist, I want to learn about the impacts. And I'm a little bit afraid that if we go too slow, then we will not able to learn about it. So we will use our priors. Our priors now, it was great success until that level. And so if we just have very small increases, it's impossible to learn because there's so many other things changing at the same time that we will just bring our prior and we will say it's still good. It's still success. And I think it's better to be a little bit more ambitious and saying like, okay, let's see whether businesses can cope with it, and if not, then we should go back to the previous successful one. So I'm kind of more in favor of once we set a target, like try to make it in a more significant. I'm not saying in one step maybe, but more significant steps, because then at least you can learn how businesses react to that and how workers are affected by those policies.
Great, thanks Attila. Very interesting, and I think that point about whether we've got a lack of jobs or a lack of good jobs is quite a helpful framing, because we've had some questions online about how to think about, which is a tricky thing, there's no right answer, the trade-off between a pay rise for millions of workers and lower employment for tens of thousands of workers, and perhaps diagnosing the problem in the way you describe is one way through that. We've had lots of questions online, which I will bring out. If anyone in the room would like to ask a question, do pop your hand up and Greg will come to you. Why don't we do that one first and then I'll do my list. And if we can bring up the first question, Emma, that will give you a minute to do it. There we go.
Hi, Irina Angel from Bloomberg. So you said that employers are expected to pass like 3/4 of the cost increases to workers this time. But how does this compare to past experiences, to the previous 2 years when we had, the quite large increases in minimum wages, but those seem to have led to wage inflation?
Great. Well, look, thank you for your question, because I'd also brought this one up to make sure we get some tricky questions for Nai. So now we've got two. So Nai, if you could explain about the 75% assumption and where that comes from, that would be really helpful. And we also had this question, which I think is important to clarify, about what 85,000 fewer jobs kind of kind of means and how we should think about that. And Attila, maybe you would like to come in on some of the broader evidence around kind of effect on wages more broadly. And then just to pick up some others online, I don't always manage with the tech, but let me try. I think useful to come back to youth rates, which has obviously come up in the discussion. I think two things perhaps going on here, which just exposes the debate. One is a concern about a million NEETs, which you mentioned, Louise, and whether a kind of higher youth rate would help there. There's also kind of big concerns about fairness. So really interested, Paul and Louise, to perhaps hear a bit more about your views on youth rates. And Nai, you might want to kind of explain our perspective on that too.
Yep.
And then I also wanted to come back to productivity, which Louise, as you say, is kind of at the heart of broader question about living standards. And I think you could see the minimum wage as a route to higher productivity, and the kind of big costs being put at the low end of the labour market here might in the end be a route to improving job quality and a higher wage, higher productivity economy, or they might be extra costs for businesses that make it harder for them to make kind of broader productivity improvements and a blunt tool. So maybe we could talk a bit about the effects on productivity too. So hopefully that gives everyone lots to choose from. Nai, should we start with tricky questions for you first?
Sure, I feel like I need to do another sort of 10 minutes
Don't do that.
presentation. The 75% we took from the OBR, but they get to that number by thinking about how responsive employers and workers are to changes in labour costs. So the reason they think that most of the cost gets borne by workers is they're assuming that workers' labour supply is fairly inelastic, i.e. the amount of people who want to work doesn't change very much when wages change. But they assume that employers are more elastic, so more responsive, and you might think that's the case because employers have other options available to them. If the wage goes up, they could, for example, use more machines in the workplace if that is relevant there. So that's where they get to that 75% number, or 76% actually. You then need to make a further guess about what the balance is between wages and prices of that 76%, but you can think about, we kind of did all of our calculations in kind of real wages space, so it didn't particularly matter to us what the balance between those are. But on the impact on prices, in general, we think the impact of the minimum wage on prices overall is small. And the reason for that is that although there are 2 million minimum wage workers, that sounds like a big number, but it's only 7% of the total workforce. So overall, minimum wage workers aren't a huge part of the workforce, but also on average, they don't work that many hours. So I mentioned earlier that majority of minimum wage workers are part-time. And so if you multiply what they're paid by how many of them there are and by how many hours they tend to work, minimum wage workers' wages overall form a pretty small part of overall wage costs. So Tim and his colleagues calculated that minimum wage workers' wages only form 2% of total wage costs in the UK. So that, if you think that through, then you think, okay, well, if the wages of those 2% massively increases, yes, that's going to be it's going to have an impact, but it's going probably to be quite a small one. And then another way of getting to the same point is that in the past there have been studies where they say, what was the impact on the level of CPI when we did big minimum wage increases? Again, that turns out to be quite a small number overall. Now, obviously, you get bigger impacts in parts of the economy where minimum wage workers are employed in bigger numbers. So hospitality, retail, you would obviously pick up bigger numbers because those workers form a more important share. So what you would expect is that over time, as the minimum wage goes up, probably we have a relative price impact. So prices in hospitality might rise faster, for example, than in other parts of the economy. And then there's a question about, well, are you happy to accept that or not? And in general, we've said that we are, because we like all the benefits that the minimum wage brings to those workers. But certainly that's a question. Some people might not be happy for their evenings out to become a bit more expensive. Do you want me to go on to youth rates as well, Ruth? I've been talking a while.
Do youth rates, but can you also cover what 85,000 fewer jobs means? Is that 85,000 people losing their job? Or
85,000 redundancy letters. No, it's not that. So it's absolutely, as Paul said, we just think in aggregate that is the change in employment we would expect. So we definitely wouldn't expect that to be in redundancies. Employers don't particularly like making redundancies. It's an uncomfortable thing to do. So, to the extent that it was an impact on headcount, you'd probably first of all expect it to show up in hiring rather than in redundancies. You'd also expect to see some of it happening in hours rather than in jobs. We didn't make an assumption in our paper about how much would be hours and how much would be jobs. When the OBR typically does this, they just assume sort of half and half, which I think is just a nod to saying they know it's a bit of both, but they don't really know what the split is. But our 85,000 number was in sort of average hours workers, so some of that absolutely could be, all of it could be in hours, but we didn't make an assumption about that.
Great, thanks. Should we let others cover youth,
Yeah.
and then I'll come back to it at the end if we've got time.
Yeah.
Paul, youth rates, productivity?
Youth rates and maybe productivity and the employment rights bill more broadly. I mean, not a huge amount to add on youth rates in terms of what I said before. I mean, I think there's about the issue about fairness and complexity, actually. It's one of the reasons why, as I say, a large number of the employers that have agreements with unions have moved to actively get rid of their youth rates, as well as the issues that Attila pointed out in terms of things like vocational segregation. But actually, if you want to get 1 million young people into education or into work or into training, what you've got to do is prove that their work has value, and arbitrarily saying your work has less value because you happen to be a couple of years younger, I don't think does incentivise people. I'll just make this other observation on that, Ruth. Quite often policymakers, I think, assume that everybody who's 20 or 21 doesn't have family responsibilities, is supported by the bank of mum and dad, probably still lives at home. That's not the experience of every 19, 20, 21-year-old or 22-year-old. People do have the same outgoings, and as I say, I think it should be on responsibilities and skill rather than age. Can I just touch on the productivity point? Because obviously, I mean, the £5 billion that the government estimated would be the cost to employers overall of the employment rights bill. We've done an additional piece of work, which we think overall the positive impact on the UK economy is £13 billion in terms of improved productivity, reduce staff absenteeism, improve staff well-being. I think it's worthwhile just making the observation, it's a little bit like the broader minimum wage point. That $5 billion will not be shared by all employers. What that effectively will mean is if you do use 0 hours contracts, if you don't pay sick pay from day one, yes, it's going to cost you, and effectively that cost will be transferred from low-paid workers back to the employer. But actually the employment rights bill will also level the playing field for those employers who don't use 0 hours contracts, who do pay sick pay from day one, who do give people things like parental leave and bereavement leave, and so on. And I think actually, if you look at another element of the employment rights bill, fair pay agreements in social care. In social care, we've got a problem with a lack of people working in the sector. I can't remember how many vacancies, something like 140,000 staff vacancies in social care. The minimum wage is effectively the prevailing wage, and 1 in 4 people are on a 0 hours contract. Well, that fair pay agreement will allow you to think about things like pay, but also career progression, about skills, and ultimately the government will have to think about funding for the sector as well. But so I do think it potentially has that. It has the potential to help drive productivity improvements in the UK, and I agree entirely with the point that Attila made. The problem out there is not a lack of jobs; it's a lack of good jobs that people can build a future on.
Thanks very much, Paul. Louise, anything you wanted to come back on, particularly kind of more on productivity and youth?
Yeah, so just kind of quickly on youth. So, I mean, most of the employers that I speak to don't tend to differentiate too much, and like you say, there's definitely that fairness perspective. I suppose the point and the value of keeping some of the youth rates is around thinking about those who, I suppose, similarly to the apprenticeship rate, you're kind of accepting that they're going through a period of learnings. So, I mean, I think, again, any employers I speak to, even if they start off, they might quickly move on to higher rates once they have got that bit of experience, but it's around, again, providing that flexibility to do it. And I do worry slightly, like I say, with those entry-level jobs, if you are cutting off a kind of route to people, and we are seeing at the moment the proportion of people who've just never worked at all, is increasing quite a lot, and that's concerning. On the productivity point, I do think that this is a really important one, and I think the argument when the national living wage is first introduced is that exactly would lead to greater productivity increases. Like I say, it's this point around you would force employers to think about improving the productivity of their staff, and I'm sure that there are definitely instances of that. But I think, again, just thinking about the current context that we are in, when you're thinking about increasing productivity, you can think about increasing your top line, but you can also think about reducing your costs and managing your bottom line. And in a world in which many of employers have faced quite a lot of shocks over the last few years, we obviously talked about the ones at the moment on the tax side, but we've had high energy costs before that, obviously impacted both households and firms. You had kind of Brexit uncertainties and costs kind of before that. You know, it does feel, when you're talking to employers about how they're dealing with some of these changes at the moment, it is thinking about, you know, they're almost in kind of crisis mode and they can't think about actually where can we make that investment. They're just thinking about how can they make their budgets add up. And that's very much, again, the impact that we've seen, particularly with the NICs increase. When we've done surveys for businesses, you know, 2/3 of them have said to us they're looking at reducing hiring. And again, that tends to be often perceived the less painful way to make these adjustments. But actually then it means the people who are left are often expected to just kind of pick up more that the other people were doing and not kind of filling those gaps when people leave. And only 5% said actually they were looking to increase their investment to take advantage maybe of more automation and things like that. And again, actually, I think an important point is around, if you're thinking about improving investment and automation in that context, you are doing it with a view of how can we reduce the kind of costly labour, rather than, like I think, say, thinking about how you can increase that top line of what is the complement between technology and people to improve productivity as well. So I think it does really shift that dynamic, which is an important factor as well.
Thanks, Louise. And Attila, any thoughts from you on the impacts on prices or productivity?
Yeah, so I think for productivity, let me start with the productivity. I think I agree many of the things that mentioned about it. Also maybe potential automation, but I also think that the automation itself could open up other opportunities for the workers. You know, and that's how productivity works. Now the worker at certain firms are used more productively, and there is another business which can come in too and use that worker. And related to this, one thing that people mentioning often in context of the UK labour market is labour hoarding is increasing these days. Now, I don't exactly know how much is it a feature of this kind of lower end of the labour market, because in this Bank of England studies, it's more overall picture. But you know, if labour hoarding is an issue, I feel like increasing labour costs, in fact, is good, because labour hoarding means that people are keeping worker and not using it, and then other business who might want to grow cannot use that worker because they're sitting in a company and they don't do much. And I just feel like, you know, if this is the case, that labor hoarding is an issue, that I think some of the cost increase can in fact improve reallocation of workers to a more productive route. So I still feel that the benefits on this productivity could be positive in this particular context. Now about the prices, I think it's generally agreed in the international literature, and also I have I think also in the UK context, I think that price is increasing in response to minimum wage, and you know, part of the cost is paid by the consumers. So businesses, in fact, in the UK, there is a much larger share of businesses claiming that they will partly paid from profits than in other contexts. So in many other contexts, businesses saying like upfront that they will pass through to consumers, and that's it. But you know, the consumer part is really important. And you know, as any tax policy, you know, like if you introduce VAT sales tax, it's kind of, you collect revenue, it's paid by the consumers partly. Here, this is kind of a policy where you kind of impose some prices on the consumer, and this goes directly to the worker. And I think that has great advantages in a sense that many people have much more negative feelings about paying higher taxes and go to the budget, and then the government spends it, who knows what, versus paying higher prices for going to the hardworking people who are, you know, working at the companies. And you know, in the service sector. So this is kind of a redistribution which is supported by a much larger share of the population. You know, it's redistribution to hardworking people. Like even if you look across the board, the political spectrum, almost everybody wants to distribute this group of people. You know, there is much less agreement whether we should increase taxes general versus increase taxes to support these people. And there is also an interesting question: how much of the price increase accompanied by quality improvements? So many of the evidence that people have looked at is like price is increasing, but quantity of the production is not cutting. That's why employment doesn't have to cut substantially. If prices would increase and quantity would decrease a lot, then there would be a significant reduction in employment. But we don't see that, so that many people suggest that maybe there are some quality improvements in terms of services. Maybe only those businesses survive who are producing higher quality services. Maybe less businesses survive, but those are more efficiently serving the customers, and that improves the quality in a way that you don't have to shed employment. So I think these are for the price increases there. Definitely part of it is coming from consumers, but I think part of it is also coming from quality improvement, which indicates that not all of it is a pure welfare loss from the consumer perspective.
Okay, really interesting. I'm conscious of time. There's so I think we should come to our poll. If anyone else in the room would like to ask a question, I will try and bring it in. And then I think we should talk about tax a bit as well. So for the poll, we wanted to zoom in and feel free to vote if you're online on this question about looking forward. This year, we know what the rates will be, but as a reminder, the government hasn't said what its policy will be for the rest of the Parliament. So we've put 4 options here for the sake of the poll, but perhaps I'll just come back to our panel on what they think the kind of remit should be for the rest of the Parliament. Whether it should be in line with earnings, which would kind of keep the bite the same, faster than earnings, which, as Nye and Paul were talking about earlier, would increase where it is relative to the median, or whether prices are more important, whether that's in line with prices or up to the real living wage, which is at the moment somewhat higher. I think we should also come back and talk about tax policy, because we've talked a lot about the minimum wage today, but Nye, you were clear in your presentation that actually the bulk of the employment effects that you've calculated come from the NICS changes. We've had a lot of questions online about whether there would have been alternative tax policies that would have had less of an employment effect, whether those be in NICS or elsewhere. So really interested to get the panel's thoughts on tax policy too. And then we will wrap up. Nye, in order to give others a bit of time to think, do you want to kick off with a reminder of your answer to this question and any thoughts on tax?
Yeah, so we picked option 3, faster than earnings. We very sort of nerdily said we'd like a specific bite increasing pace of 1 percentage point per year. Other views on exactly what the pace should be are available, but yeah, the basic conclusion that we drew from looking at the evidence was that there is space to increase with respect to the with the median. I would reiterate again that this kind of tone in the second half of our report was we should adopt more caution than we have in the past, but our policy is more ambitious than the government's current policy, which is a sort of a funny situation, because the current government's language in the election was very ambitious indeed. They said we're going to make the minimum wage a genuine living wage, but it turned out that that's in practice their policy was hold in line with earnings. So yeah, that is our policy. Has everyone had enough time to make their own minds up?
Yeah.
Go for it.
Well, I'll just repeat what I said before in terms of ambition for the minimum wage. I mean, our formal policy is £15 an hour as soon as possible and 75% of median earnings, but with a clear role for the Low Pay Commission in if you like, setting the flight path, glide path, whatever pathway you want towards that. Just on taxes, I mean, fundamentally, the Chancellor put in a huge investment into public services in the budget last year and into infrastructure, and she needed to. I mean, I don't think anybody could identify a public service in this country that's better now than it was 14 years ago. Partly the reason it all got loaded onto employers' national insurance because Labour had ruled out so many other things before the election, and sound like a stuck record. I mean, I said before the election that we needed a national debate on tax, and I still think we need a national debate on tax. I mean, I do think, I'm not going to write the tax code now, but whether it's wealth taxes, equalising capital gains tax with income tax, there are other things the government could and maybe should have done. But I actually think it was necessary. I mean, we did a poll of employers a few months back. 60% of them said staff were taking time off because they couldn't, they were stuck on an NHS waiting list, or the kid was waiting for special educational needs provision in school. So the state of public services directly impacts on businesses. And 82% of businesses said actually the state of public services has an impact on them as an employer. So this stuff doesn't come for free. But I think there is a broader debate to be had. It can't all just be about national insurance. And I think the government was wrong to rule out certain taxes before the election.
Really interesting. Thanks, Paul. Louise, anything on tax policy you wanted to say or come in on this question?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in this question, as probably expected from our side, so I mean, we support continuing the remit to target 2/3 of median, but we think that is the kind of right level that it should be at, so more moving in line with earnings, and actually that shift should be, like I say, for broader policy around increasing living standards rather than kind of putting all our eggs in basket in terms of this. On tax options, I mean, in many ways, agree with Paul in terms of, they did really box themselves into a corner, and which only left them with nicks. I think it was particularly damaging to have done the nicks change in the way that they did, and having that big increase at the threshold, and like we say, the way that we then have this confluence of policies that are hitting all those at the low paid. So I think that you should think about how they can make sure that burden is shared a bit more widely, and probably a bit more on those households that can afford it. But I do think it's also important, and this is where we've now seen the announcements over the last couple of weeks of the government themselves thinking about, we're talking about employers thinking about investing in productivity, investing in technology and automation that they do need to do themselves. So I definitely take the point about there is lots of pressure within the public services, but I do think there's a lot of opportunity to think about how can we actually do things better and in a more joined up way as well.
Really interesting, thanks. Attila, any final thoughts from you?
No.
Leave tax policy to you.
Yeah, exactly.
Fair enough. In which case, let's see the results of our poll, and then I will. So, in line with earnings, that is not necessarily what I would expect for a Resolution Foundation event. So, interesting answers there. Although the two extreme answers getting the most votes, so I don't know how much that helps the LPC and the government navigate. Thank you everyone for coming. Thanks for everyone for joining online, and huge thanks to our panel for a really interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.